Style puzzle indexical, and this is an abbreviated version of my paper. So there are things that are going to be left out. But what I'm going to try and do here is, this will be my roadmap. And what I want you all to leave with at the end is the idea that there is this puzzle presented by Perry, and I guess have a basic understanding of why that is indeed a puzzle. So yes, I will explain the puzzle, I'll explain why that is important, what solutions that are offered, so that will come from both Perry and Tiffany, and then I will offer what I think. So, begin. Puzzle. So, I think it's fun, but we'll try this. So we'll try this thought experiment, and I apologize for everyone who's heard me talk about this numerous times. It gets a little fast. So, let's consider that I'm at a supermarket, and I realize that there is sugar on the floor, and I'm like, that's not good. And I'm a good person, so I decide that I'm going to tell whoever is making the mess that they're making a mess. And in the process, I realize that I am making a mess, and so I correct my bad. And so Perry uses the same example in his paper, and he calls it the problem, or he calls it a problem. I like to think of it more as a puzzle, and I want to actually thank Professor Silva for giving me that language. So the idea here is that how do we characterize my change in behavior or anyone's change in behavior from thinking that someone was making a mess to them believing that they are making a mess? And so it may not seem like a problem because intuitively something like I am making a mess can be understood by all of us. So there's something public about it. But it's private in the sense that it only means something for that person in that instant. So in essence, that is the puzzle. And in the handout, you'll notice that I bold that, and hopefully it's not too wordy. So, okay. So, Perry also tries to motivate why this is a problem, I guess in a technical way. And so this is through what he characterizes as the doctrine of propositions. And so this he takes from Frege, and I'm going to omit Frege because it just gets a little complicated, but we'll just go with the doctrine of propositions and actually have them listed in the handout. And so one helpful thing is to think of what a proposition actually is. And for purposes today, I'm just going to say a proposition is the object of a belief. And so in this example, we'll say that's me with a big head. And I think that Mark Twain was an American author. I don't know if that's the correct way to say it, but let's just say that's what I think. And the proposition then would be that, the actual object of the belief. So if we were to say what was happening there, I would say, I believe that Mark Twain was an American author, but the proposition would actually be Mark Twain was an American author in this context. So Perry thinks that something like I am making a mess is a problem because if we notice, the second tenet of the doctrine of proposition says that a proposition has an absolute truth value. So it's absolutely true or false. And I am making a mess obviously is not. So it can't be a proposition because I am making a mess will either be true or false depending on the circumstances one finds himself in when they believe that. Whereas something like Mark Twain was an American author is, it's true. So with that being said, we'll just remind ourselves of the puzzle again. The puzzle being that I'm making a mess is something that we can all come to believe, and it can all have some, technically speaking, like motivational force that would cause us to act. But it does not all cause us to act in the same way, across all circumstances. So, Perry offers a solution. He calls this belief states. And I couldn't find it, maybe it is in there, but he never really defines exactly what a belief state is in the paper. So, I like to think of it as actually just like the circumstances one finds himself in when they are believing something. So, believing I'm making a mess, and we could all do this right now, is going to mean something entirely different than when we are at the supermarket thinking that someone's making a mess, and then we come to believe that, respectively, individually, we believe that we are making a mess. So, that actually has, those are different belief states. And Perry thinks that things like I am making a mess could be maybe called something along the lines of a relativized proposition and help us discriminate between what kind of belief states people can have. And belief state is a state that we would expect people like myself to be in that can be characterized by sentences like I am making a mess. So Perry thinks this gives us a more full account of how meaning works and the relationship between belief and action. So now I'm going to move on to Tiffany. So I apologize, I'm moving really fast through this. But Tiffany wants to say that the use of I in this example, in I am making a mess, may not necessarily, or may not be necessary. And he says that this is because Perry includes like a fourth tenet in the doctrine of propositions. And he calls that the APR assumption. So the APR assumption basically states that a given term has the same, what he calls cognitive significance, which leads to the same motivational force, or the same action for all people. And the reason why Tiffany thinks Perry has something like this is, we might think, well, maybe Perry came to believe something like John Perry is making a mess. But Perry says, no, I believe I am making a mess. That's what works for me. And Tiffany says that only works if we think John Perry means the same thing for all people at all times. Because, if it could be the case that John Perry means something just for John Perry, or Mark Silva means something just for me at a given time. It doesn't have to be the case, maybe, that Mark Silva means something for everyone, across all instances. So that's what Tiffany wants to say, that this APR assumption, holding that a given term means the same thing for all people at all times, may not be necessary. So, let me move on to his solution. So he talks about psychological realism, and then also the APR assumption to look at two sort of data sets from which he's going to make some points about why, in this example, Perry may not be correct in saying that the indexical is essential to explaining my change in behavior. And so he looks at Bob Dole, politician, and he also looks at children. So in the example of Bob Dole, he says, well, let's take Bob Dole, who I guess is infamous, famous, notorious, I don't know. He is known for, in his campaign speeches, saying things like, Bob Dole promises he will lower your taxes, Bob Dole will do this. And so Tiffany thinks, well, Bob Dole uses his name in a way that seems to motivate him to act, which would violate the APR assumption, because it means something for him that's different than what it means for me or you or anyone else other than him. And then in the case of children, I think this has probably all happened at some point. They seem to refer to themselves in the third person to explain why they did something. And so Tiffany thinks that would also violate this APR assumption. So if we accept Tiffany's position, then that means that Perry may not be right, and that I am making a mess is what caused him or me to correct the sugar daddy. But I disagree. I think Perry is closer to the truth. And the reason for that is perhaps there is something like the APR assumption that is worth considering, but I think the evidence that Tiffany uses is inappropriate. One, I find it hard to believe that Bob Dole doesn't think he is Bob Dole. And if he thinks he's Bob Dole, then that's an indexical, he. And that would involve the I, so that when he says, Bob Dole makes, promises you that he will lower taxes, I think he still probably thinks I am Bob Dole. And so the indexical still comes out. And in the case of children, I think it's inappropriate in the sense that, most of us think in a way intuitively like Perry. And that's why this really doesn't seem like a problem, but more of a technical puzzle for how we think of the theory of language. And so for Perry, I is perfectly fine. And so maybe it's just that children aren't yet competent users and speakers of the language. And that, at one point, at some point they will eventually use I am making mess in the way that, we're thinking of it. So with that being said, I do think that Perry is closer, at least in this example. I don't feel like I'm in a position to really go beyond at least this thought experiment. But I think in trying to understand why we would change our behavior from believing something like someone is making a mess to I am making a mess, the I is important. So that is the conclusion of my presentation. Real quick, fast into my references. And then I just want to acknowledge my parents, the philosophy department, comps mates. Thank you, Jordan, for that term. My professors, and there's tons of text, and my friends, and yeah, so thank you. Questions?
I don't see how I is an indexical. Can you please explain that to me?
Oh, sure. Yeah, so I guess what would be helpful in is actually defining what an indexical is.
We class and refer to myself as I there. It's the same I.
For you, yes. So I think the idea here is that something like I am making a mess, all of us can apprehend, and it means something. But the I in each case means something different than it does for you, than for me, than for everyone else. So the I, in that sense, the meaning is relative to whoever conceives or has a belief.
So when I say I in the same class, it has a reference.
Yes. Okay.
So I think.
But like here and now are different because if you say here, it's already gone. I mean, that's, right? Or if you say now, that's gone too.
Yeah, yeah. So those examples I think might be a little bit better for motivating like exactly this definition. Yeah, because obviously now will mean something.
It changes everything, yeah, it's gone.
Exactly.
Okay.
But there are different possible contexts according to across which it ships, depending on the particular term it ship.
Okay. Those are two different kinds of index tools, aren't they?
Yeah, so I guess you could break it down even more, and some people have. For example, I think Kaplan uses this idea of content and character to break down lexicals even more. I found that kind of over my head, but yeah. So just for, I guess this is at least in the way I gave the example. This is kind of like a simplified, quick, and dirty version of index.
Okay.
I was just going to ask about the APR assumption and whether there are any examples of terms that violate it that aren't proper names.
Oh. Yeah, so I would think, I can't come up with one right now, but I would think maybe something that means something in one language, that means something different. Yeah.
But that's a proper name.
Okay.
The name of the sled.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe like, I mean, it's hard to distinguish between like things that are really associated with and things that are part of the meaning. You might think like, snakes for Indiana Jones, right? Like, not for the rest of us.
Okay.
I don't know if I can give an example.
So Greek House was just saying maybe natural time terms. Other than
Yeah. Natural kind terms?
Yeah. I don't know, like.
When you just mean like Easter, or like it means something like Catholic religion and like Greek Easter is completely different.
Oh, yeah, yeah, I think that would work here. Yeah, because the idea then at that point, like when someone uses it, it means something different. There's probably the relationship between having a belief that uses that term is different in the action it produces for someone than for someone else. Yeah, so it seems like then you have a violent belief.
So gold is one that you might think is a net, I think. Right, gold might be.
Yeah. You look puzzled, Professor Chan.
If you go back to Perry's, I don't see the puzzle
Yeah.
Perry's thing.
So
I mean, so the change in belief states from someone is spilling sugars, both of those are true. Someone is making a mess. Should it say someone else is making a mess? Because you are someone.
Oh, I get what you're saying. I think the presumption then, is that someone is meaning someone else. So someone other than I.
Okay, so
Because then presumably I or Perry or anyone else would have just picked up our bag right away because we would have thought that we were actually making this.
okay. So properly formulated to see a change in behavior due to a change in belief. Be someone else is making a mess to I am making a mess.
No, I mean, so I don't believe someone is making a mess, but
But
they're
you-
not fair enough, right?
Yeah, but you're still someone. I mean, it's still
Yeah.
true that you are making a mess and that you are
Right, and it
someone.
doesn't motivate me to behave any differently, but when I come to realize that I am making a mess, then I need to.
Why is it a change in belief and not just kind of a specification or determination of the object of belief? Like,
I think at least in this
it's not a change of kind.
Well, I think what might help then is what Perry, if maybe we think of belief states. So in this context, someone's making a mess. Perry, it's in a belief state where Perry thinks that it's not him, that it's someone else that needs to correct the mistake that they're making. And then when he comes to that I am, he's in a belief state that when he actually thinks that he's indeed making the mess, and therefore he actually looks at his card and picks it up.
And that requires two change in belief states.
Yeah, and so and this is kind of technical, but idea that, you know, propositions alone can't explain the relationship between belief and action. And so people think that like someone like Frege, who gave us a distinction between sense and reference, means that a proposition can explain and account for that relationship between belief and action. So you give a belief and the object of that belief explains your action. But in this case, then that poses a problem, because if we don't consider the belief states in which those propositions or relativized propositions are conceived or you know, thought of, then they don't really have that relationship.
You're done.